All right, the last issue I want to discuss about the Bible's puzzling depiction of the afterlife is the problem of what happens to people who had never heard of Jesus, either those who died before his time period or maybe lived in an area where people just never heard of him or for whatever other reason. Now, the problem with the religious explanation is that we have to believe that this holy book, this alleged guiding light from an omniscient author, just doesn't provide clarity on a subject that at least supposedly applies to the eternal fate of billions of people. Maybe the people who never heard of Jesus are just out of luck, or maybe they're not, depending on how you interpret passages that are open to an endless number of interpretations. Now you contrast this with the clarity and logic of the secular explanation, which has it that when it comes to compilation books of this nature, which a book that is written by over dozens of authors, a time span of well over 1,000 years, and it's written by ancient people whose travels were largely limited to the Middle East, but whose writings are now attempted to apply to every place on earth and every place on earth throughout history. Well, gaping holes in logic and in knowledge are exactly what we'd expect. I mean, it makes perfect sense that the New Testament authors didn't write about how God will judge the Japanese or the Native Americans or the pygmies in the Congo. The New Testament authors had no idea that these people even existed. Now, of course, the problems I'm discussing with these religious explanations, now these are only problems if you try to think matters all the way through. But as long as these ideas are not thought all the way through, torturing one's logic doesn't necessarily come into play. Because I find that with the exception of Christian apologists, and I find that apologists are something of a rare breed in the way that they study the Bible, I find that most Christians really don't think about the subjects that I'm bringing up here. And most of those that I interviewed weren't even aware that the Bible had different stages. They just assumed that the Bible was consistent from the Old Testament to the New Testament, that right from Genesis, that God was talking about Judgment Day and heaven and hell. Just consistent throughout. Now, this seemed to be especially true for Christians whose religion was just more based on them being raised in that culture, that their religion was just an unquestioned part of their identity. And also for those Christians who came to Jesus through some spiritual experience. They claim to experience his love directly and feel his comfort directly. Now, for these people, issues like what the Old Testament says about heaven and hell versus, or the contradictory passages that it contains, what happened to people who lived before the time period of Jesus. I mean, that's just all dusty history. Many of these Christians, or at least most, I don't claim to have any statistics here, at least just from my personal interviews, and again, these are people who are not apologists and who are not proselytizers. It seems that most of these people just feel that faith in Jesus, and at least attempts at living a moral life, that's enough to get them into heaven. End of story. It seems to me that this belief that it's not death awaits you, but an eternal life in heaven, this idea is so appealing that even if you do study the Bible and you stumble upon some of its difficulties, this just very appeal of heaven can transcend the Bible's lack of clarity. It can transcend the Bible's contradictions, because that comfort it provides is so strong. Now, alleviating fears of death, of course, that's one of religion's main appeals, and even one of the main reasons for religion's very creation. Now I'm going to close with a passage about the afterlife from Stephen Jay Gould's An Urchin in the Storm. And this is from page 240, in which Gould is referencing Bach's motet that you're not made of flesh, but of spirit. And Gould's comment is that much of the greatest work in philosophy, religion, art, and music exists either to bewail our mortality or to argue that a spiritual continuity permits us to accept the physical decline and eventual decay of our bodies. Ever since we learned the fact of our pending mortality as the most unfortunate consequence of evolving a larger brain, we have done our best to mitigate its doleful message. Thanks for watching.